In this video, I'm going to show you how to do glazing and gradients with your airbrush. In my video on color glazing, I showed you how to use transparent layers of paint in order to establish highlights, details, and color gradients on your miniatures. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to do that exact same process, but 10 times as quickly with an airbrush. I'm also going to be showing you how I do multicolor gradients like I did on my Nighthaunt figures. This video is the third video in a series. If you haven't already watched my video on underpainting and glazing, you might want to watch those first because this video is going to be building upon the concepts established in those first two videos. In this video, I'm going to be using the following list of supplies. I'm also going to leave a full list of the supplies I use in this video down in the description. In addition to these supplies, you're going to need a basic working knowledge of how to use an airbrush. In this video, I'm going to be painting the Nighthaunt from the Age of Sigmar Stormstrike box set, but you could be painting any miniatures that you like. Before we start, you're going to want to assemble your miniatures and apply any basing details you might want to add. Here you can see I've assembled the miniature using plastic cement and used a little bit of basing paste and grit to add some detail to the figure. For this step, we're going to be using the same basic steps that I used in my video on underpainting. You can watch that video here. The only thing different with these figures is going to be our light source. Instead of having the light only coming from above the figure, we're also going to be having light sources on these figures coming from inside the figures. For the glaive wraiths, this additional light source is going to be the contact point between their ghost wisps and the ground, sort of like a flame coming up from inside the ground. And for the banshees, the brightest point is going to be the tips of their heads, sort of like a lamp covered by a bed sheet. So we're going to use our same process from the video on underpainting, but then we're going to go back in and add some extra highlights to those parts which we want to have that additional light source. You can see here that I'm spending extra time adding very bright highlights to these extra light sources on the figure. For the banshees, this is not going to look that much different than normal because the lightest point on the figure is still going to be at the very top of the figure. However, we're still going to go a little bit further than we usually would to give the effect that there is a glowing point near the top of the figure. And for the glaive wraiths, we're going to do the normal process of zenithal highlighting, but then we're going to go back in and add a second point of light near the ground on the figure where the wisps are contacting the ground. On these figures, the lightest point of the model will actually not be on top, it will be at that contact point on the ground in order to get this flame effect. Since I forgot to record footage of what the full underpainting process looks like, here are a few photos from my Twitter of what the final underpainting ended up looking like for these figures. This should give you a good idea of how bright the highlights should be and how dark the shadows should be before you apply your airbrush glaze to these figures. Once you're satisfied with your underpainting, we can move on to step 2, which is airbrush glazing. Before we begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about the definition of a glaze. When you're painting with a paintbrush, a non-airbrush paintbrush, it's really obvious what is a glaze and what isn't. When you add glaze medium, that's a glaze. With airbrushing, this definition can be a little bit more subtle because we're not going to be using glaze medium in our airbrush. So when I talk about airbrush glazing, what I'm really talking about is just thinning down your paints to the point where they're going to become extremely transparent, and we're going to be able to see all the details from our underpainting underneath these transparent paints. So if I'm being completely honest, I don't really need to give you a tutorial on airbrush glazing because airbrush glazing is literally just thinning down your paints to the point where they're transparent enough to show the details underneath. How much you thin down these paints is going to be determined by the individual colors. In general, maybe a good starting point would be 1 drop of paint to 4 drops of thinner, but it's going to depend completely upon the color and the paint formulation. It's really going to be something you have to experiment with depending on what paint you're using. So rather than ending the video here, I thought I would make this video a little bit more interesting by showing you an example of how I use airbrush glazing to achieve really cool, smooth gradients like I do on my Nighthaunt. So really, this is actually just a stealth Nighthaunt tutorial that I disguised as a video on glazing because everyone's been asking for a video on airbrush glazing. I apologize, I'm really sick today, so my voice is a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about airbrush gradients. An airbrush gradient is simply a smooth transition from one color to another. For a simple example of this, you can take a look at my video on how I painted the iron golems from Warcry. In that video, I did an airbrush gradient of 2 colors. In this video, we're going to be doing an airbrush gradient of 5 or 6 colors. So it's going to be a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to show you the entire process of how I achieve this. When I do most of my airbrush gradients, I like to use colors that are next to each other or at least related to each other on the color wheel. In this video, we're going to be doing a gradient between a very dark blue to a slightly lighter purple to a medium light pink to a very light pink. So what we're doing here is we're doing a gradient both in terms of hue as well as in terms of value. Hue being the color, I think that terminology is right. Let me look it up. Yep, I was right. So hue is the color like blue, purple, pink, and value is the lightness or darkness of the color. So in this video, we're going to be doing a gradient in terms of hue and in terms of value. Value being from light to dark and hue being in terms of colors on the color wheel. When painting an airbrush gradient, you're going to want to start with the lightest color first and progress towards the successively darker colors. The reason for this is that it's very easy to cover over a light color with a dark one, but it can be very challenging to cover over a dark color with a lighter one. So in case of any mistakes or just in terms of blending, I find it's helpful to start with the lightest color first. In this example, our lightest color is going to be Rosy Flesh, which is really just a very pleasant coral color, which is sort of like a mix between a pink and an orange. I don't know, you can see it on screen. It's a very pleasant color. It's one of my favorites. We're going to do a 1:4 mixture of Rosy Flesh and airbrush thinner in the cup of our airbrush. After mixing our paint together, we're going to layer on this paint onto the very brightest points of the miniature. You don't have to be too careful at this point because a lot of this color is going to get covered over by the next color we're going to apply. And in fact, we want the colors to mix a little bit, so we're going to apply the Rosy Flesh color to a bit more of the miniature than it's going to cover by the end of our process. If you wanted to at this point, you could probably even cover the entire figure in this color and it wouldn't really matter because it's going to get covered over by other colors later on. For the glaive wraiths, we're going to want to make sure we get really good coverage near the bottom of the figure where the wisps are contacting the ground. And for the banshees, we're going to want to make sure we get some really good coverage on the tops of the heads of the figure. We're going to want to apply a lot of thin, successive coats of this color to the miniature, but not so many that it covers over our undershading. For the second color in our gradient, we're going to use Warlord Purple, which is actually a very versatile and bright magenta color that I recommend everyone keep in their collection. For this color, we are also going to create a 1:4 mixture of Warlord Purple and airbrush thinner. Now with this color, we are going to want to cover the entire surface of the miniature except for the parts that we want to remain that Rosy Flesh color. So again, for the glaive wraiths, this is going to be everywhere except for the points of light that we want to maintain. And for the banshees, it's going to be everywhere except for the very tips of the head. The reason for this is that the Warlord Purple is going to form a really good foundation for the other colors that we're going to put on top of it. And also we're going to want to overlap the Warlord Purple a little bit onto the Rosy Flesh, because as you can see, it creates this really interesting peach color when the two colors blend together. This is actually a key part of doing an airbrush gradient, is that you want to have the colors slightly overlap so that you're getting a new color being created when the two colors intersect. This is what creates that very smooth gradient type of look. On the glaive wraiths, we are also going to be covering the rims of the bases with Warlord Purple so that it creates this idea of a point of light that's being surrounded by a darker color. For our third color, which is going to be Royal Purple, we're going to apply it to an even smaller portion of the miniature. We're going to put this just on the very top of the wraiths and over a large portion of the bottom of the banshees. You might not notice a huge difference between this color and the previous color, but I like to put this color on just because it creates a really nice transition between the magenta color and our next color, which is dark Prusia blue. Did I say that right? The dark Prusia blue, I've never said that out loud before. For the dark Prusia blue, we're going to be creating another mixture of 1 to 4 of thinner and our paint, and we're going to be applying it just to the very tops of the glaive wraiths and to the very bottoms of the banshees. Almost forgot what we were painting. What's going to happen here is just by applying a very thin coat, the blue is going to mix together with the purple to create a really nice deep indigo color. So we're not really going to be seeing what the blue looks like, we're really just going to be seeing what the blue looks like on top of the purple. As a final step, I like to create a mixture of 1 to 4 of blue-green and airbrush thinner and use it as the most sparing color in this scheme, just to create a final little highlight for some of the blue parts on the figure. You're going to want to apply almost none of it to the glaive wraiths, and I put a little bit more of it onto the banshees because I felt like they needed a bit more of a highlight at the end of their ghost wisps, but it's really up to you how much of this color you use. And that's basically it. That is how I do airbrush gradients. You can see that there are a lot of advantages of doing the gradients this way versus by hand. It's a lot quicker, it's a lot smoother looking, and it's a lot more fun, saves time. It's just better. If you have an airbrush, you might as well do this versus doing it by hand if you're doing these sorts of broad gradients. So if that was the information you wanted to get from this video, you can feel free to go home now. Class is dismissed. However, if you'd like to stay for a little bit longer, I'm going to go through how I finished the last few steps of painting my Nighthaunt. In this step, I'm going to show you my 3-part recipe for ghost ectoplasm, which is what we're going to be calling all of the parts that are skulls or hands. It's not really clear if they're made of bone or what, so they're ghosts, so we're just going to call these parts ectoplasm. I picked this color because it contrasts really well with the rest of the figures, and it's a really nice color. I like it a lot. For the base coat, we're going to use our wet palette to mix up a 1:1:1 ratio of blue-green, lime-green, and glaze medium. After doing this, we're going to realize that it's actually too transparent and too green for the base coat we're trying to do, and we're going to add more blue-green. making this a roughly 2:1:1 mixture of blue-green, lime green, and glaze medium. I am a big fan of this color. It is not a color that I know of a bottled paint for, but I end up mixing this color a lot for a lot of different figures. Once our colors mixed up nicely, we're going to put a little bit on our brush, wipe off a lot of it on our paper towel, and then we're going to carefully apply this color to all of the skulls, arms, hands, as well as the bone ridges on the backs of the glaive wraiths. I like to take my time with this process and apply about 2 to 3 layers of paint to all of these areas. The reason that I like to take my time is that if you have any of this paint spill over onto the parts of the miniature with the gradient, it's a bit of a pain to clean it all up because it's a gradient. So if that happens, you can just use the colors that you used in the gradient to try to hand blend it back to where you want it to be. But I would advise you to go a bit slow with this process because you get the point. For our second step in the ectoplasm process, we're going to apply Drakenhof Nightshade over the entire surface of all of the ectoplasm areas to help shade this color. You can put as much of this color on as you want, but I find it's good to take your time and try to make sure it just gets in the recesses. It's okay if it gets on the rest of the bones though. Once your shades are dry, they're going to look something like this. Although you don't need to wait until the shades are dry in order to go on to the next step, which is going to be our highlight phase. For the ectoplasm highlight, I like to use a 1:1 mixture of glaze medium and pale blue. This color is going to create a nice ghostly highlight that's going to help all of these ectoplasm-y parts pop on your miniature. You can also go back and use a little bit of your base color to help blend the colors if you find that the shade made the color of the flesh too blue. In general, you're just going to want to use your brush like you would with any glaze, wiping off the excess and putting on the paint in very small, thin coats. I like to go in and make sure I highlight as much of the faces as possible, including the individual teeth, which I find really helps make the miniatures pop. When you're happy with how the ectoplasm looks, we can move on to some optional shades and highlights. At this point, these figures look pretty good as is, and you could totally stop at this point if you're doing a large army. But there's a few little things that I like to add to these figures to make them look a little bit more finished for my liking. The first thing that I notice is that often the rosy flesh color gets kind of blown out by the other colors, maybe because it was the first color we applied. So on a lot of the figures, I'm going to go back in with a 1:1 mixture of Rosy Flesh and Glaze Medium and just brighten up a lot of the Rosy Flesh areas. Once that's done, we're going to mix up a 1:1 ratio of Glaze Medium and Pale Sand on our palette, and we're going to use this color to highlight the Rosy Flesh areas. I like to go pretty far with these highlights because on these areas we're trying to create the effect of a light moving outwards. So you could have parts which are pure pale flesh near the very center of the flame for, I don't think it's actually a flame, but it's the effect of a flame where the lightest thing is at the, you get the idea. The point is, don't be afraid to go too far with highlights in this portion of the figure. If you find that you put on too much pale sand, you can always add more Rosy Flesh on after to tone down the color. These pale sand highlights are really going to help with that glowy effect that we're trying to achieve in these areas on the figures. I also like to take a little bit of pure pale sand without any glaze medium on a dry palette and use it to dry brush some of the sand particles and stuff on the base. I find this really helps sell the idea of the light source coming from within the Nighthaunt. I also like to use some of this pure pale sand to edge highlight certain parts of the figure, like the weapons and especially the hafts of the poles on the weapons, because there's a lot of details which work really well when you edge highlight them. I don't know if I've covered edge highlighting before, but basically you're going to want to use the side of the brush rather than the tip of the brush, and a drier paint than usual to run it along the ridges that you want to have the color on them. For the next step, we're going to take a little bit of Drakenhof Nightshade and apply it to the darkest recesses of the blue and purple parts on the figures. I find this helps boost the contrast on these parts of the figure. In the same way, we're then going to use Reikland Fleshshade on any of the coral or pink colors on the figure. You want to be a bit more careful with the Reikland Fleshshade because most of the pink and coral colors we want to look like they're glowing, so just be very selective about where you put your shading. If you put on too much, you can always just use some of the original colors on your palette to clean up later. On the Banshees, I use basically the same steps that we did on the Wraiths, but I also like to mix up a 1-to-1 mixture of blue-green and glaze medium to highlight their wisps in the same way that we highlighted the wisps on the Glaive Wraiths. And with those steps done, we can also use some pure blue-green on our dry palette to dry brush the bases of the Banshees, much like we did with the Glaive Wraiths. With these steps complete, we are done painting our Nighthaunts. Thank you for watching my video on Airbrush Gradients and Airbrush Glazing and Nighthaunts. I thought I would cover a lot of these things in one video because they're all interrelated. If there was anything in this video that was unclear or you'd like to see expanded upon, please feel free to leave a comment down below. I'll get back to as many of these questions and comments as I can. I'd also like to extend a huge thank you to my patrons on Patreon. Thanks to you, I'm now able to take a day off every week from my day job to put into making these videos. I really don't know what else to say other than thank you so much. I'm blown away by all of you that have decided to donate to my Patreon. If you'd like to see your name up here, or if you'd like to see some additional footage from my videos, you can subscribe at patreon.com/DanaHowell, or follow my daily painting process on Twitter and Instagram at Dana_Howell. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.